Hi, and welcome to another Trucks Unique TU How To. My name is Chris, and I'm going to be your host today. And today we're going to be talking about lift kits, different types of lift kits, what spawned lift kits over the time, a bunch of different things. Basically, we started off, lift kits basically have been around since the late 70s. That's about when people started doing it. You might have had some people in the older days doing lift kits on old muscle cars, stuff where they lift the back of the car up in the 60s and stuff like that, but it's a little bit different than what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about lifting four-wheel drive trucks. Now, as far as I can remember, the oldest, the first thing that really started lift kits was monster trucks, and the first ever monster truck was built in the late 70s. And the truck was a big popular one, a lot of people know, and that's Bigfoot. A guy named Bob Chandler built that truck, and when he built it, he built this big old huge truck, and he started crushing cars, and people like just got amazed by it, and were like, man, I have to do that to my truck. So people, of course, haven't taken it to that extreme. I mean, there are some people out there that build their trucks that tall, but for the most part, you have to keep it to a more civilized level instead of crushing cars, you know, speed bumps and stuff like that. It's a little fun. So anyway, so that's kind of what got everything started. We're going to kind of go over the evolution of how suspension has changed over the years. Basically back in those days, all the truck had was leaf springs. So you have, basically you have your axle, and then you'd have, a stock truck would usually have a spring that would go like something like this, and you tie into the frame right here and here. So you had to make a negative arch spring. Well, in order to get lift, what you'd have to do is you still have your axle, and then instead of going negative arch, you'd go positive arch. So you'd have a more of a U-looking spring instead of a negative arch spring. Now, depending on how much U or arch you put in, positive arch you put in the spring, would depend on how much lift you go. You could go from, you know, mild arch, give you a couple inches of lift, more, and the more as you go up, you get more lift. Now, back in those days, you know, the monster trucks, they'd actually use a spring that was a U. I mean, it was, you know, so the ride was horrible, they bounced all over the place, there was really no suspension, but it got the truck up there and it looked cool. And that's basically what that was about. Over the years, springs have gotten a lot better. Back in those days, it was just like I said, big old U, and you do it now. You can do it based on using flatter springs, and you just use more springs. So what you do is you use a lot more thinner springs all tied together in one spring. Now they're not usually spread apart. Usually they're a lot closer together. But you use more springs that will make the spring pack a little bit taller, but then also give you the arch, and so you have a nicer ride versus if you had just a couple springs that were arched in a big, you know, U. So that's kind of how those work. Now, pretty much leaf springs, you really don't find leaf springs on the front of any of your four-wheel drives anymore. I don't think there's any leaf springs. Maybe on some vehicles back in different countries maybe, but in the States, as far as I know, all the trucks that are out there now are pretty much coil spring or something like that, and that's what we're going to go with. The next one, coil spring is kind of the newer solid axle spring. What you'll have is you have a spring, excuse my rude drawing of a spring, but you have a spring tied to the axle. Now, on something like this, you can't just have a spring and an axle. You have to have something to control the axle and keep it all going. So you're going to have links that come off the axle and come back to the frame, like this. And these links will control the ride of the suspension. Now, usually to lift one of these kind of kits, all you do is you run a taller spring, or you can run a spacer on top, but usually you just run a taller spring, and then you have to run longer links to compensate for the axle coming down. This is just a drawing, so this is, when you drop it down, these links have to be longer now, so it keeps this line still centered. So on these trucks, so on the coil spring trucks, that's basically what you got. And then you can do, then you have to do longer shocks and everything like that. Now, the benefits of a coil spring suspension versus leaf spring is a smoother ride. It's going to have better handling characteristics, better suspension flex for off-road. You can build leaf spring systems to do all that, but it's a lot more it's a lot more costly to do it than to do a coil spring setup. So that's basically your basic designs. You still see this on Ford Super Duty, Dodge Ram, 3/4 ton and 1 ton trucks, Jeep Wranglers all have this coil spring with some sort of link design is still the setup that those trucks have.
You mean the stock trucks?
Yes, stock trucks. Now, also, when I was talking about monster trucks in the beginning, nowadays monster trucks run a design similar to this too, where they have a link design that goes down to the axle, and then they have a coil spring or a coilover shock that controls the ride. These trucks are completely different. Back in the day, they'd be lucky to get a foot off the ground. Nowadays, these things are jumping 20, 30 feet in the air, landing no problem, like it's no big deal. It's amazing how things have changed over the years. The other type of suspension system that we have, this is the most complicated one on the market. There's a couple different forms of this, and that's independent front suspension. What independent front suspension, or a lot of people call it IFS, so it's independent front suspension. Now the way this works, I'm going to draw this one looking at it from straight on, like if you're looking at the front of the vehicle, because if you look at it from the side, you can't really tell really how it works. Basically the way it works is you have your frame that mounts here, and then you have a lower A-arm that comes down like this, and then up here farther on the frame, you have another A-arm. Okay? So what happens is what they call independent front suspension. You have independent. So the driver's side and passenger side operate independently from each other. This gives you the optimum ride. It's the smoothest ride you can have. And what's cool is because this side you can hit a bump on this side, this tire comes up, but this tire stays right where it is. So it just goes real nice and easy over the bumps. Works really cool. Now, because the suspension design is more complicated, it's a little harder to lift and more costly because there's more parts involved and everything like that. Now, you have two different forms of IFS. You have a torsion bar IFS and you have a coilover shock IFS. Now, the way that would work is now I'm going to show you from the side. If you're looking at the side of the vehicle, say this is your A-arm here. Okay, on the torsion bar setup, you're going to have back here on the frame, you have a torsion bar that mounts to the frame, and it goes into the lower A-arm, into a hex mount. And what happens is this bar is solidly mounted here, but it twists up here, and what it does is you just twist the bar, and that's basically your spring. You don't have no coils or leaf springs or anything like that. All you have is a bar that twists, and that bar has a certain torsion to it, and that's what gives you your suspension control, and then with the shock. Now, the newer setup that you're seeing is you do the same thing. We have an upper, you have a lower arm, but now you have a coil-over shock that goes up to the frame. And the way this works is you just have a shock inside a coil. And by doing this, you have the coil that acts as your suspension and the shock that controls the balance and the ride of the vehicle. So that is your new, that's basically the different forms of an IFS suspension. Now, when it comes to lifting those, that's where it becomes fun.
Very rarely.
What you want to do is, we'll go back to our first design here. In order to lift this, you can't just, put in, like on the torsion bar truck, there's only really a way to do it. What you have to do is you have to drop all these down. And what you're going to do is you're going to get a new cross member that comes in here and it goes something like this, and then your A-arm will now come down here instead of up here. So you'll take this away. Now, some of the original IFS designs with the torsion bars, what they would do is you'd drop your lower A-arm, your upper A-arm, you drop it down as well, and then you keep all your stock geometry here. Well, nowadays what you're doing is instead of that, you don't drop the upper A-arm at all, keep it in its stock location, and then you run a bigger knuckle that spans the distance that you would have. By this, you drop this down, and you drop down your axle, which usually sits in here somewhere. And you have your CVs that come down. And then that's basically how you lift an IFS truck, is by dropping everything down.
I don't understand.
Well, they're going to change.
If you're lifting it, why are you dropping everything?
Well, because what you have to do, let's see if I can show this in that light. What you have to do in order to lift the vehicle, to give it more height, you have to drop everything down to keep all your proper angles. So, in other words, you have an axle in the front. It's a little bit different than your typical solid axle that you have on the truck. It's similar in the center. But what you have is you have what they call a CV axle on it, which comes down like this, and it's a flexible unit for that independent suspension so that it can move up and down. Well, when you lift the truck, say this is your stock set. I'll do a lifted set up here, and then I'll the stock set up here. So you have your steering knuckle, you have an upper arm that comes in here, and you have your lower arm that comes in here. Well, in order to lift this, and there's your frame. In order to lift this setup, you have to drop all these items down with the axle has to come down as well in order to keep the proper angles. You can't just lift it where this comes down. It doesn't work that way. You have to actually drop every